And of course, we'd like to thank Roland for all his sterling work and effort, continuing and over the past 4 years with the Whitehead Research Project and all these conferences. As he said, I'm Michael Hailwood. I think you all know why you're here. We're very lucky to have Isabelle Stengers and Donna Haraway. I'll be as quick as possible. The format is that Isabelle's going to talk for roughly 35-40 minutes. Then Donna is going to respond, and after that we will have questions from you. So that's enough from me. We'll get going.
Thank you. And thank you to all organizers. Being invited in Claremont is something you cannot refuse when you are interested in Whitehead. I call it the Mecca. So usually I turn to the Mecca for my prayers. Now I am in it. So my talk has for its title, Civilizing Realism. Philosophy, wrote Whitehead, never reverts to its old position after the shock of a great philosopher. We are not gathered to envisage reverting to Descartes or Leibniz philosophy, all the less so as they themselves did not know that they would be classified in the category of speculative philosophers. It may be said that with Kant creating such a category, a new proposition did enter our world and created, as every new proposition, a before and an after for all the experiences that would entertain it. As Whitehead characterized it, the question, what do we know, was transformed into the question, what can we know? Of course, such a transformation was never exhaustive. Again and again, original thinkers have escaped the restriction. Among them, I believe that Whitehead occupies a very special position. Since we are gathered here about the question of things, I would illustrate this position by imagining how Whitehead, who once, it is told, associated reality with being in the middle of a rugby pack, would answer this question. Maybe he would just say, use common sense. Not only Whitehead, as a speculative philosopher, never positioned himself against common sense, but it may even be proposed that the cause he was serving when he turned into a philosopher was the defense of common sense as attacked by theory. As is well known, Whitehead's revolt against what he named the bifurcation of nature was in the name of common sense, of what we do know, even if we cannot theoretically justify it. And we also know that this bifurcation still rules today, creating new absurdities or reproducing old ones under the guise of new great questions, such as the emergence of feeling or value from blind interconnection between blind and indifferent processes. How to understand the awesome capacity of what Whitehead diagnosed as absurd, its capacity to infect its environment again and again, producing a divide between what should matter and what we do not need to pay attention to. Whitehead himself provided an answer. The great and dangerous innovation of the 19th century, he wrote, has been the discovery of the method of training professionals, then defined as vectors of progress, but a progress in a specialized groove, demanding that no further attention be paid to what the groove ignores. But the question may then be raised of the way their environment tolerated what may be described as a general attack against common sense, the only agreement between professionals being that its protest, the protest of common sense, should not be allowed to matter. And it may well be that such a question of the tolerance begins with the professional themselves. An interesting hypothesis, indeed, is that the power of abstraction, their misplaced concreteness, and the always recurrent "what can we know" critical question are to be related to what Bruno Latour as described as a flying backwards. The moderns, he wrote, would turn their back on the future they run towards, looking to the past, a mobile and frightening past they cannot distance, which will engulf them if they do not run. You want us back to the cave has been the answer to protests, rather commonsensical ones, against our very unsustainable development. And the cave here is not only that of prehistory, but Plato's cave, the realm of irrational beliefs, always ready to conquer the present. Because of the cave, it would be our duty not to slow down and pay attention to the consequences of our actions for the future. It may well be that the power of professional abstraction, the only point of agreement of which is the disqualification of common sense, relates progress not with trust, but with fright. The installing of such a fright may be narrated, but no narration will explain the fright. It functions rather like what Whitehead calls propositions infecting experience. Each invoked justification is a food for the proposition, and this proposition has for its direct consequence the definition of progress as what must be imposed for their own good to recalcitrant, frightfully irrational others by those who know better. As we know, this has become the refrain for the colonial conquest of the world, but this conquest has begun on the very European ground and is still proceeding. Others are also us, and what we do know. The more a so-called scientific proposition hurts common sense, the stronger its claim to rationality. We deal here with what I would define as a very touchstone for what we may call, one way or another, speculative thought. Either speculation takes us still further from the others, verifying that our very strange adventure puts us again and again in a very classical position since Plato of getting access to a truth that would permit to guide the others out of the cave of illusions, or it helps our abstractions and those who deal with them to present themselves in a civilized way, that is, without insulting those we present ourselves to. The second option situates me and my interest for Whitehead, knowing that this option for civilization may not be sufficient because of the self-hate, mistrust and resentment that has been induced, knowing that it is the least we can do as philosopher and non-philosopher. Invoking common sense in this context is thus evoking a defeat, not some universal anthropological consensus, something everyone on this earth would subscribe to, bringing peace and mutual understanding. When Whitehead defined philosophy as the welding of imagination and common sense into a restraint upon specialists, he trusted common sense not as some innate wisdom, but as what can be enlarged as it is welded to imagination. In other words, common sense would be defined by the ability to deal pragmatically, imaginatively, and without confusions with the many things we know and the many abstractions that are relevant for knowing them. Common sense, then, for Whitehead, is not prisoner of abstractions. It is rather able, if welded to imaginative narrative, to entertain abstractions as lure for feelings. It is what both science fiction writers and ethnographers trust when trying to interest their readers in different worlds and different ways to have the world matter. In brief, I would propose that common sense, as understood by Whitehead, has no special trouble accepting the situated character of any knowledge. It is rather an artist in matters of situatedness. It is our theoretical words and philosophical concepts that confront us with the dilemma. Either they situate their user as the educators of humanity, or their users resort to irony, reducing claims, demands, and patience to a matter for polite conversation. That is, they give up the value of rationalism as an adventure of hope. Whitehead wrote that we have no right to deface the value experience, which is the very essence of the universe. What we may have to give up, however, is the excess of subjectivity that taints whatever we call truth. This, I would propose, is what Whitehead's philosophy is about. Never forfeiting the demands of truth, but adding still another demand, that our truths be able to situate themselves, that is, to present themselves in a civilized manner. It may be because Whitehead was a mathematician that he felt no qualm accepting truth as always situated. Since the Greek mathematicians have honored disclosure, the self-evidence and beauty of the demonstrated mathematical truth. But they would never deny or downplay the adventurous construction of the demonstrative path, a path Hegel denounced as devious, because it may include embedding the initial question in a wider setting, which creates the possibility of the answer. This, as we know, is the reason Whitehead gave for not reading Hegel. However, Whitehead here as elsewhere also inherits William James' trust, a trust which includes no guarantees, but situates us in the entangled adventures of a pluriverse in the making, through the creation of always partial connections. William James wrote, "We can and we may, as it were, jump with both feet off the ground into or towards a world of which we trust the other parts to meet or jump, and only so can the making of a perfected world of the pluralistic pattern ever take place. Only through our precursive trust in it can it come into being. We can jump, and it is only mistrust, with its demand for guarantee, which guarantee against irrational belief, that leads to deface and denounce what I would call the speculative jump, the jump towards something that cannot be derived from the settled ground of matters of fact. It can be said that Whitehead, as a mathematician, knew that James' precursive trust is the very blood enabling the mathematician's creative work. In Adventure of Ideas, Whitehead proposed that the speech of Pericles to the Athenians should replace the book of the apocalyptic revelation as the final book in the Christian Bible. Pericles' speech presupposes trust in a vital possibility, the production of a contrasted unity among Athenians, weaving together and not denying their diversity. And the collective experience he activated is the very experience of William James' pluriverse in the making, the fragile but cosmic achievement of the felt experience of contradictions being turned into contrast, and of divergent adventures celebrating their need of each other in order for each to explore its own possibility of attainment. Whitehead's proposition to make Pericles part of the Holy Scriptures is not, I am convinced, the conclusion of a philosopher. It is rather a deep felt conviction that contributed to turn Whitehead into a philosopher. He was no Pericles, and he was not a Quaker either, even if he paid homage to the Quaker spirituality when he characterized the way each occasion, as engaged in its own immediate self-realization, is also concerned with the universe, emphasizing that he was using the word concern in the Quaker sense of the term. But he himself trusts the possibility to turn the unruly crowd of our conflicting concepts into a pattern of contrasts. Using Whitehead's own remark that two philosophers are needed for a philosophical school to perform its full service to philosophy, I would even suggest that Whitehead situated himself as the one who came after William James, reducing to rigid consistency James' exploration of experience. Furthermore, I would propose that Whitehead's adventure as a philosopher is itself a pluralist one, exhibiting the relation between the Jamesian precursive trust and the experience of the mathematician, who knows that the jump cannot be dissociated from the ground it lives. You never trust in general, and you never jump in general. Any jump is situated, and situatedness here is not limitation. If a jump is always situated, it is because its point is not to escape the ground in order to get access to a higher realm. For a mathematician, the jump, connecting this ground, always this ground, with what was alien to it, as the necessity of an answer. The ground itself is crying out for new dimensions. In concept of nature, a first cry resounds against the bifurcation. All we know of nature is in the same boat, to sink or swim together. It defines a speculative challenge as a commitment. There will be no halfway house, no psychic addition that unifies the beauty of the sunset and its objective interpretation in terms of electromagnetic waves. This cry unfolds the radical consequence of the definition Whitehead had initially given. Nature is what we are aware of in perception. Awareness is calling for a jump, but mutely so. Indeed, the constraint defining the towards of the jump is left undefined. Whitehead commits himself to a speculative realism when he adds the following very commonsical constraint. I quote, "We are instinctively willing to believe that by due attention more can be found in nature than that which is observed at first sight, but we will not be content with less." Whitehead does not demand guarantees ascertaining the definition of nature. He demands that nature be approached as liable to reward due attention. He does not specify how we will discriminate the kind of attention which is due in different situations. He rather commits himself at the very point Kant took the inverse commitment, writing that we do not learn from nature, but impose on it our questions as a judge with a convict. That nature must be such that the way we pay attention to it makes a difference is not a definition of nature as noble. Certainly, when a mountain climber envisages a rock face in terms of the foothold it offers, she pays attention to the mountain in terms of possibilities of climbing. But the climber is not crazy. She knows that the mountains offer other opportunities, other footholds, for many other kinds of being, from birds to grass, moss, and fungi. As a speculative realist, Whitehead will demand that nature be such that it offers footholds that do not privilege our intellectual abstractions. Our perceptive organs are also concerned, and more generally the various equipments of any living being, as they all affirm that a lack of discrimination may exact a death penalty. The concept of object making ingression and the contrast between events which when they are gone, and objects which may be there again, are not some phenomenological rendering of our experience. They are the Whiteheadian answer to the call of what we are aware of against bifurcation. A very carefully crafted answer indeed, precisely satisfying Whitehead's realist demand. Very often, philosophers' initial commitment strangely enough, results in the production of some master key, as is the case, for instance, with the famous cogito ergo sum. Descartes took the cogito as his only ground for certainty, and it finally gave Descartes the means to escape all uncertainty and proceed to the at last rational conquest of everything there is to know. In contrast, Whitehead's generality, organized around the concept of nature, are crafted in order not to conquer anything, rather to resist any demand that we define reality independently of how it matters for us. More generally, Whiteheadian realism is aiming at constraining our abstract definitions, never to deny what they require. If any natural knowledge is situated by the attention, by the kind of attention we pay, by how we discriminate what matters and what does not, it must never authorize abstractions that would deny the relevance of such attention or discrimination, that is, that would erase situatedness. I would propose this is an ethical point about all Whiteheadian abstraction. The craft of Whitehead answer, as opposed to the Cartesian conquest, give me a hold and I will define the world, God included, thus makes the difference between jumping off the ground and mysteriously getting speculative wings and the power of surveying the whole landscape. Jumping is not made for the thinker to fly over, rather, as with the famous image of the airplane flight, to land again with renewed attention and imaginative question. And this will be the case even when Whitehead's philosophy will become openly speculative in process and reality. I am aware that some Whiteheadian scholars consider Whitehead's speculative proposition that occasions are the only res verae as defective. Not only reality would be incomparably atomic, but even less able than physics to account for the enduring and obstinate thingness of things. Indeed, occasions are essentially transient. Surely when they perish as subjects, they are not gone as concept of nature events, but they are at the mercy of new occasions, which will have to take them into account, but will be free to determine how they will do so. The paradox here is that the concept of organism in science and modern world was rather strikingly providing what seems to lack in process and reality. An organism is that which endures. It is limited, obstructive, intolerant, infecting its environment with its own aspect. Value, as it corresponds to the mode of achievement of what endures, means first of all partiality, the drawing together in its own selected mode of the larger whole in which each enduring being is situated. In process and reality, organisms are still referred to, and Whitehead still speaks about his philosophy as the philosophy of organisms. But critics are right, endurance and value are now divorced. Endurance designates societies, a derivative notion only, since it characterizes a nexus that is a gathering and not a real togetherness. Real togetherness and value now designate actual occasion, but actual occasions are not obstructive or intolerant. Once they have passed into objective immortality, they are available to appropriation. However, there is no paradox if we admit that we deal with distinct, not contradictory, but contrasted germs or leaves. Not only each Whiteheadian concept dramatically exhibits the general truth that any of our words is mutely appealing for an imaginative leap, but the leap, his concept appeal therefore cannot be dissociated from the question that situates them. Organisms were the answer to science and the modern world leading question, that of the order of nature. This order is not what we are aware of in perception, it is what we depend upon for the maintaining of bodily life, what interpretative perception trusts for better and worse, as it is permeated with anticipation, and finally, what scientists put faith into when they do not just proceed by generalization from observed facts, but struggle to have these facts testify to a more general functioning that would characterize nature. That is, when they are realist. The order of nature is thus a matter of multiple concern, each with its own way of making it matter. The concept of organism is the attempt to answer to the call for a pluralist unity in contrast with our dominant scientific abstractions which identify unity as a truth beyond diversity. Whitehead's jump, answering this call, was radical in oath. Against the abstraction derived from physics, these jumps came to demand taking no continuity for granted, rather defining any endurance as a particular achievement, with its selected value and always dependent on what Whitehead called the patience of the environment with regards to the way an organism infects it, to the role an organism assigns to it. Whitehead proposing organism as a unifying concept may be correlated to the task he assigned to philosophy, to take care of our modes of abstraction. The choice of terms like infection or patience is deliberately crafted to call for intuition against the authority of explanation. Any explanation or justification requires the endurance of what they explain. Not only the explanation, but the very characterization of what is to be explained are relative to what endurance makes matter. They are situate as they require and take advantage of what we cannot ever take for granted. Endurance. As such, the concept of organism was meant to renew the realist faith in the order of nature, a plural order, because each science confronts distinct contrasts between patience and impatience. This contrast is dominant in historical, psychological, and social sciences, while the trust in endurance shapes the abstraction and explanations of physics. But organisms were named to indicate the now privileged position of biology, where endurance is exhibited as an achievement, where mutual infection is the rule, and the patience-impatient contrast transformed into entangled patterns of mutually intra-action, to borrow Karen Barrett's term. When the developing embryo is concerned, this contrast is even woven into a dramatic plot, the unfolding of which contemporary biologists just begin now to discover. I would propose that organisms link realism and speculation in a very concrete sense, a sense that rather directly questions what we call a thing. Indeed, using this term may well unilaterally emphasize endurance, as when we contemplate a mountain. Organisms, in contrast, as they make continuing endurance an achievement, exhibit that to be real is not to be self-sustaining. Contemplating a mountain, or for that matter a spoon or a chair, corresponds to a particular case. It is to address the general case is to address a thing. It corresponds to a particular case, contemplating a thing and maybe wondering what we can know about it. The general case is that addressing some being as real is a matter of speculative concern. What does this being require for being itself? What may disrupt its way of enduring? Scientists' claim for realism is verified by their very concern that the environment they impose upon what they address in order to question it does not irreparably distort the answer they get. The problem is rather different for the police inquirer interrogating a suspect, for the marketing man wishing people to buy what they do not need, for the political activist trying to activate citizens' impatience, or for the therapist helping somebody to escape an enduring sufferance. But whatever the concerns, there is no answer without a groping, speculative experimentation, as when one gets acquainted with somebody, with her zones of robustness and her zones of fragility. Speculation, not contemplation or vision, testifies for the reality of what we address. When Whitehead made actual occasions the only res verae, he took a last daring jump, but again a situated one, which may be associated with the demand of what he calls the metaphysical standpoint. I quote, in Science and Modern World, we will forget the peculiar problems of modern science and will put ourselves at the standpoint of a dispassionate consideration of the nature of things. Organism and the order of nature will then become particular application. The introduction of the new name, society, for what endures, may well be indicative that social and historical sciences, not biology, have become the leading reference. While endurance is a matter of wonder for biologists, it calls for a dispassionate attitude for the social scientist. What matters instead is the possible as such, as exhibited by stability and disruption, hope and despair, rebellion and repression, claims and doubts, propagation of new ideas and justifications of their silencing by the need to defend society. What I would insist upon is that dispassionate consideration does not refer at all to a vision of truth beyond the illusion produced by passion or partiality. The obstinate endurance of organisms is no illusion. Endurance is derivative because of the very passionate partiality of the goal which Whitehead's new jump was answering to. The ground Whitehead is now jumping with both feet off demands that the possible as such be justified, as well as a hope for relevant novelty, without which there would be no jump. Correlatively, forgetting peculiar problems of science, for instance, does not mean that accessing the nature of things demands reaching a contemplative experience when nothing matters any longer. It rather means that something else is mattering. What matters now, what must be civilized, is philosophy itself and its addiction for a truth beyond illusion. The challenge of a dispassionate consideration is thus emphatically not entailing a jump towards a hidden reality behind the scene. The first definition of res verae is that they are creatures of creativity, and creativity is not some supreme truth, but what must be equally and without privilege exemplified by any of its creatures. Any is now the challenge. Far from being some kind of speculative vision, this challenge requires from us, philosophers, the highest degree of partiality, resisting our most cherished habits of thought, leaving no stone unturned if we are to practice what Bruno Latour called irreduction. From the metaphysical standpoint, nothing can ever be gifted with the power of explaining anything else. All are thus and are therefore are productions, exemplify creativity. Whitehead wrote, "No reason internal to history can be assigned why that flux of forms, rather than another flux, should have been illustrated. The ultimate freedom of things lying beyond all determination was whispered by Galileo, e pour si muove. Freedom for the inquisitors to think wrongly, for Galileo to think rightly, and for the world to move in despite of Galileo and the inquisitors. This ultimate freedom of things, which divorces the new speculative res vera from endurance, is referred to an immediate experience we should never deface, because it is ultimate freedom. It is the foundation of our experience of responsibility, of approbation, of disapprobation, of self-approval, of self-reproach, of freedom, of emphasis. Foundation of our experience. An experience that crucially matters when we celebrate, as Whitehead said, the ascent of man, with the conscious, passionate feeling of solitude, and maybe the problem, what can we know? But an experience which should be civilized, which should not have the power to give its universal foundation to human freedom and responsibility. This passionate consideration rather turns it into a situating constraint. If our own adventure puts such an emphasis on individual freedom, we should not justify it, but go all the way with it, never denying it to anything we name real. This passionate consideration does not demand a disavowal of passion, accepting in a dispassionate way what Whitehead called the multifariousness of the world, the fairies dance and Christ is nailed to the cross, and I would add, philosophers claim we are prisoners of Plato's cave. Whatever are many ways to access what we call reality, they are all passionate, as they all imply learning how to pay due attention, and accessing metaphysical reality is no different. It only proposes that due attention be paid to all the shortcuts which one way or another permit first to hide a rabbit in the hat, and then to triumphantly discover it, and discover with it the way to privilege some selected, passionate interest, making them what feminist research is called unmarked gender, able to evaluate everything else. That is why the situating constraint Whitehead puts into action in Process and Reality is the prohibition of any shortcut that makes such tricks possible. This constraint is what Whitehead named the ontological principle. Actual entities are the only reasons, so that the search for a reason is to search for one or more actual entities. Adopting this very demanding principle imposed to Whitehead his major imaginative leaps, including his final concept of God. It's time to conclude, I believe. If philosophy is to weld an always situated common sense and the adventure of imaginations, philosophers are to learn to value both the imaginative experience and the craft of welding, of adding new relevant, always partial, never innocent dimensions and contrast to what may appear as a well-defined situation. Daring an openly speculative realism in Process and Reality, Whitehead did not dream the usual philosophical dream of converting everybody to philosophical truths, getting everybody out of the cave. He rather designed a device, or what he called a matrix, that would enable
learning
philosophers
other
to learn
people's
this craft of welding,
Oh,
to
Isabelle's
learn
been
how to
very
tell
good at learning the
stories
abstraction
that
of the
would
neo-pagan
open
ritual.
questions.
And if
Yet-
people in this room think that talking about God in the academy is out of line, I dare you to talk about the neo-pagan witches. Or to be serious about the goddess as an abstraction of serious, that is seriously needed in talking about something like disclosure, or in somehow making someone like Heidegger no longer quite so poor in world. That if one is really serious about the kinds of interrupted and entangled abstractions, it's no longer good enough to do this from the Greeks on. And we know more than we let ourselves know. We have colleagues, we have friends, we have conferences, we have books, we have all sorts of stuff. Not to be the scolding post-colonial, but actually not to let philosophy or science or any of the rest of it any longer be that unmarked set of categories. Our abstractions are too poor in world. So if we're going to take that leap of trust from our own situated ground, that is to say we do know something. In fact, we know rather a lot. And owning up to knowing something is the only way to be a serious person. But owning up to knowing something about living and writing in a time of human-induced mass exterminations and mass genocides is actually about figuring out what those other abstractions are to think with, if Tara is not to totally lose patience with these organisms whose endurance is now seriously at stake. So that's what I mean by the SF mode, or as a graduate student who recently finished in my world called, in a dissertation, far-fetchings on and in the SF mode. He was working with Ursula Le Guin's far-fetchings and her notions of talking backwards and her people who have their heads screwed on backwards. Well, I'm kind of interested in screwing our heads on backwards in Deborah Bird Rose's sense, to wonder what process philosophy might be like if we weren't so much looking for relevant novelty as what relevant something else, somewhere, it's not a relevant past, but it's something that isn't quite so enamored of the new and of creative and of whatever it is that the West thinks it does, which it has done such that Tara's run out of patience. I think that's enough.
Okay, we're going to move straight to questions. I know some people, I don't know everybody. I'm going to try and be fair. So, who wants to go first?
I have a question for Professor Haraway.
Donna, otherwise known as
What?
Donna.
Okay. Thank you so much for both of you coming. I just wanted to talk about these abstractions of infection and the way that the words, like the language of infection, are used, of like the production of exterminations, particularly within human-produced abstractions of infection, like the 1980s AIDS crisis, and how that applies to applying a social change, getting to these things where we can actually look backwards, forwards, and into the future, and how we can get rid of these abstractions of extermination. And
You want to get rid of the abstraction of extermination.
Yeah, well,
I kind of want to stay with it.
to stay with it.
I mean, I actually think that extinctions are happening at an extraordinary rate that is extraordinarily difficult to deal with the perceptual apparatus of a bipedal hominid. So we have this really extremely helpful instrumentarium to get at the fact of human-induced mass extinctions. It's an interpretation. In that sense, it's certainly an abstraction and an interpretation. But I have no interest in getting rid of the abstraction. I have some interest in slowing down the operation.
No, that helps clear up my thought a little bit.
Okay. By the way, I think I actually have a term for this, the relevant novel, something that is a kind of a synonym for what Whitehead means by the relevant novelty. And Isabelle, in another place in her notes that she gave me, talks about the work to be done. And it's the relevant work, or the relevant play. It's not so much whether it's new or old or inventive or novelty or not, but it's that which is to be done. It seems to me that Whitehead is very good at provoking us to caring. It matters what is to be done. That isn't just the old 19th century Russian nihilist question. And it's very interesting that it's a nihilist question, in a way, that what is to be done seems to me what Whitehead is really about, and that we overuse the figural seductions of novelty.
Yes, but if I can, it is true that I was from time to time also perturbed by the importance of novelty in Whitehead because it's so like us, a static tradition, and we are the vector of novelty and all that. But it seems to me that for Whitehead, and it is the way I understand him, relevant is maybe more important than novelty, which means connections. What was disjuncted comes to play together. And this, I would say, this may be said in many ways. It is novel because what we were indifferent to now may make a difference. So this interest to the way others may make matter their world, and all this can be said from our standpoint, but we are situated. It's relevant. The task to be relevant with regards to that knowledge is a production of novelty because we were not. We were indifferent. So,
Or a production of memory. It may be,
but he would say, I think, production of memory is...
well, no memory
so,
for me, perhaps.
Yeah.
But perhaps the novelty that we need is not at all a novelty for someone else.
Exactly.
But indeed, they're very conditions of no longer being able to be ongoing. I mean, I think of the, for example, the recent earthquake in Haiti, and what it takes to produce a relevant novelty in the North American public in terms of getting a grip about what is not a natural disaster, in terms of getting at the connections that are so built into the situation that the grasp of that might be a relevant novelty for those who are brought to care. But it's the grasp of the conditions of living and dying, I don't know if that's making any sense, including what constitutes flourishing. There's plenty that's novel here, but it's not all to be invented. Some of it is to be learned as a first grader because it is well known.
So I just want to say first that I really appreciated the talks. And both of you used the term speculative realism in one of your presentations. And both of you also really emphasized the use of Donna's term, I believe, situated knowledges. And so I wanted to ask after how you think about the relation between those, because in the way that it's often been discussed, speculative realism is thought to be something which is about, critique of so-called correlationism, and the possibility of thinking in itself, or thinking the absolute, perhaps in a manner which might be taken to be incompatible with an emphasis on situated knowledges. And I ask the question not to sort of ask you to criticize speculative realism on those grounds, or to criticize situated knowledges from the position of speculative realism, but rather to ask both of you, maybe, if you could talk about how you understand a kind of situated objectivity. Donna, you've just mentioned a very helpful instrumentarium, which expands our perceptual capacities. And Isabelle, you've mentioned Whitehead's great passage on the sunset, in the concept of nature. amplifying, again, what we know about the natural. And so how both of you think about technology and science as a production of sort of situated objectivities, if indeed that might be a way of thinking about it.
Well, I think that my efforts, Donna efforts, other people like Bruno Latour efforts, is to make non-separable what we call objectivity and equipment, and to make it not contradictory, to separate with the dream-like of some kind of objective vision by separation from illusion, to say objectivity is produced and happily so, and it is the more interesting, the more the way it is produced is understood. So objectivity is not a philosophical theme, and it has nothing to do with thing and the thingness of thing. Objectivity is always situated, it is always a matter of concern, and as such situated by the kind of concern, while maybe the thingness of thing may be a matter of many concerns, of the plurality of concerns.
Yeah, I mean, Isabelle and I play cat's cradle with each other. There's relaying of string figures, that where the patterns really matter. And I think both of us, and I think Bruno Latour and many others are committed to the notion that the last thing in the world anybody needs is explaining something by something else so as to explain it away. And that certain kinds of correlationism strike me to take that form, and certain kinds of critical practice, very important and dominant kinds of critical practice, with which we can do without. That's an English sentence. To take something seriously is not to explain it by something else, is to be at risk to it, to be available to it, to somehow be undone and redone in the encounter. And that's a kind of, that I would regard as speculative thought or something like that. And it certainly will involve all sorts of operations, maybe even including certain kinds of statistical correlation. I don't know, that's not the problem. Being at risk to the thisness of something before running off to try to explain it in terms of something else, that is one of the things that Isabelle and Bruno taught me to say. Now, speculative realism is a term I'm learning to use in a sentence. And I feel like I need to use it in a sentence 10 times as some sort of staying after school assignment. I'm being facetious slightly. It strikes me as the new kid on the block that has adopted a label for himself. Now I'm really being mean. All kinds of extremely interesting things are going on under that label, however. Okay? So I am tempted to try to live on the block and see if I can rent out an apartment. It's what happens when one meets a creative new move that is maybe not so new and carves out of territory and whatever. It leaves out most of the girls, and that always makes me mad. I get very, very grumpy when all the new names seem to be attached to a certain kind of, you see my problem. My passions are not obscure, okay? And yet I've been seduced. I'm curious. I'm interested. I'm intrigued in what's going on this block. Okay, and so I'm an appropriative sort of person. I cut and raid, and appropriate, and try, see what it does in my neighborhood, and so on and so on. But that's exactly what I think. That's how I experience Whitehead Isabelle talking about Whitehead. That is pensée avec Whitehead in a Stengerian mode in my reading, in my cat's cradle game with you. In that it's a sort of, there's a precision needed, there is a taking this mode of doing a philosophical inquiry seriously and not necessarily sounds like that, immediately, analogizing it to something else and stealing it. But it's also being at risk to being interrupted by it in such a way that you don't use your own abstractions in quite the same way, again. Okay? So there's no question that situated knowledges, which grows out of a particular moment in the history of U.S. feminism, which was a moment of saying, hey guys, the last thing in the world we need is downward mobility of the mind. The last thing in the world we need is some kind of anti-science feminism. And objectivity is a precious achievement, and let's not toss babies in bathwaters. And that situated knowledges have to do with situated does not mean local, in the sense of some sort of I am local, and you know, I have a national heritage park called the local. The situated knowledges are at risk, and to tying in new threads, to holding on to this knot and not some other one, to claiming to know something, not to claiming to know. And it seems to me one of the beauties of the natural sciences is that they can indeed make very strong and obligatory claims to know some things. Thank you. And they're not optional, nor are they universal. But that universals, in Nana Singh's sense, in her beautiful book, Friction, universals are built, and universals are precious achievements, and they are very fragile. And we could use some durable universals these days. Not in the old sense of a general or a universal, but we could use some built big stories. We could use some big stories that really hold us together. And to do that is going to take being at risk in some novel ways. So that's what I mean by situatedness. And truly speculative realism strikes me as a relatively recent proposition of a holding together. That is partly oppositional to certain other currents in philosophical toolkits, but also partly invitational. And I'm kind of more curious about the invitations than the oppositions, which is why I'll even still hold on to Heidegger's open, in spite of all the trouble with it. I'll hold on to almost anything that still is presented as an invitation.
If I may add something about correlation, if I begin my talk with Whitehead idea that what do we know was transformed into what can we know, this was the beginning of the true correlationist tradition. So my curiosity, because it's a novelty and I am not completely, I am here also to listen and to understand, is how much is it not still in the what can we know tradition? Or is it escaping the what can we know? Is it accepting Kant and then trying to escape? Or is it, as I think Whitehead did, trying to answer to all what we know anyway? So this is my I don't know what I'm thinking about the new speculative realism thing, because I balance between a dramatization going on with Kant's proposition that is needing the correlationist opposition in order to speak, or a new way to articulate what do we know.
We have Jim and then Judith.
I just wanted to come back to Donna's comments about temporality and futurity, and I think the dramatic intervention that we make with them. I think certainly the way that you contextualized it in terms of a set of social, political practices and continuities of caring in the past, I think make it a very important and relevant question to be asking. And I wanted to then take up what Isabelle was talking about relevant novelty, because it seems to me, I quite agree with you, but it seems to me also that in Whitehead we don't have novelty as novelty. We have novelty always in connection with inheritance. So that it is that, in fact, one cannot have novelty without inheritance, because it is only through the contrast of the data that is the things in the world, in a sense, that are brought together in this new occasion, that novelty is always crafted in and through inheritance, whether one wants to call that past, temporality, whatever. So it seems to me that another way of thinking of it is using a phrase that I'm fond of in Whitehead, and this is the notion of the becoming of continuity. That is, that continuity is something that is not pre-established, but is always made, but that continuity then is novel, but it is a novelty that brings with it memories, brings with it physical memory, if you a range of brings with it the past, or at least the present, or the kind of present that we're talking about, an extended present, and that involves yes, continuities like continuities here as well. So I don't think that what you're suggesting is really that far removed from Whitehead at all.
I think it's not an opposition, but it might be a contrast worth staying with. And also I think that that becoming of continuity sounds a little different if one says becoming with, that all becoming is always becoming with it not known in advance and not preformed in advance, which is exactly what Whitehead is doing. His abstractions allow one somehow to think that the partners truly are not pre-existent entrants into interaction, but in Karen Barad's sense, really are intra-action, and that also one never starts from zero, that it's turtles all the way down, one never starts from scratch. And I think of the way that in Brito's paper called Will Non-Humans Be Saved, he talks about St. Darwin, and it's a really nice passage. And he talks about the understanding that, which I think is Whitehead's notion of organism, that from the point of view of Darwinian biology, which has truly never been digested, is yet to be understood in its radical, non-futuristic, non-teleological, non-organismic sense, that every single act of ongoingness, action of ongoingness, is a becoming with that is at risk, among other things, for not continuing. And that the really normalized and domesticated and trivialized and tamed, which for a person who defends the domestic is really a bad set of metaphors, but I can bracket that and go on. Nonetheless, these bad senses of domesticated and tamed notions of reproduction are not Darwin's. That every organism is a risk in ongoingness, and that time is never the same as it was, and never guaranteed. That's much closer, seems to me, to what Whitehead's about.
In fact, it is what he, through me, it was what he learned from Whitehead of most crucial. It's that any continuity is a reproduction. And the always risky character of reproduction.
Or what Judith Butler might insist, a re-something. It isn't
that's a word he used.
I know.
I'm not sure it's the best, but it's a word he
It's
used.
how to use these words seriously while interrupting at them. Using them seriously and interrupting at the same time as using is a way, it's the, not irony, but a mode of, it seems to me laughter is a really critical philosophical tool. And that every single one of our abstractions must be used seriously and must be laughing at itself in its very use. In some way that the very statement of it is a bad joke. Something.
It's a matter of slowing down, as Isabelle.
Yeah.
I'm keeping an eye on time, so Judith and Levi and Roland, but we are running out of time. So,
I'm glad to get stuck on the heels of your turtles all the way down, because I'm wearing turtles all the way down.
Our turtles in round.
That's right. I'm so struck by the sort of fertile dynamic of this sort of quasi-debate about, the sort of, is there sort of an excess of futurity in at least the metaphors and some of the constructive tools that we have in the process tradition in Whitehead versus an understanding of the notion of novelty and futurity as, pardon the word, grounded in the notion of relevance and reproduction and continuity, et cetera. And it strikes me that maybe the way, it doesn't feel like there's an overall, the kind of novelty language or the relevance language, but really how we're going to do this as philosophers is a question of some kind of effort. Now, some kind of, again, pardon the word, volitional act, not a particular model of volition, but some kind of
Matter.
yeah, and I'm wondering if maybe, I'd like to hear either of you comment on the fact that maybe the place to resolve this or bring it to the next stage is to talk about the effort, the volitional, the laborious dimension, because that's where it's gonna, to get concrete, if we're talking about the project of memory, and trying to valorize that, one has to make an effort at that. The kind of memory that you were bringing up, it doesn't just happen. Someone has to do it, or it's not going to happen.
I think it's about play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think volition and effort may be a bit misleading because there is no dynamics in that. But I think what needs effort is daring to get out of the purely philosophical tradition. Donna told about my interest for neo-pagan witches, and to me it is very important that I speak about neo-pagan witch and the memory of the burnt witch and
The stench of the burning in the nostrils.
Yes.
Is one of Starbucks.
And this idea that we may situate ourselves as that it opens a choice for people living in Europe, but in US also. Are we the children of the burners, the hunters, or of the witches? It produces a speculative fabulation. It's not good or bad, but it's a new option when we say we. So I think, to me, it's extraordinarily important to be able to very seriously speak about neo-pagan witch to my philosophy students. And I think this kind of, indeed, cascading also with diverging risks is important, because it may be that doing so, speaking about them my way, may help them in a way I cannot predict. It's cascading. But I think that it's more daring, but not daring foolishly, but daring than volition,
Right.
Yeah, I also think that we, whoever that is here, inherit a sacrificial structure when we think about the work to be done. We inherit an asceticism and a notion of deferring pleasure, a notion of literally an Abrahamic story and a deferred justice story, and that somehow the effort to somehow do good, to somehow open up the space of reform. And we really inherit this weird structure of sacrifice that I think Derrida probably did the best job of getting at the logic of how it worked. And that I'm much more interested in what a biologist named Mark Beckhoff has to say about the possibility of ethics having been introduced into the world, almost certainly not from prohibition, but from play. From entities taking the risk of using their inherited repertoires otherwise, and the experience being something that may as well be called sheer joy. That out of that, caring is possible. Whereas out of prohibition, at the end of the day, it really isn't. And it will result in critique and cynicism and laziness, or do-goodism, or something. But I actually think if there's to be some kind of adventure of hope, it's going to come out of the risk of play. And it's joy.
We're over time already, and I was told strictly to keep to time. So how about, do you have a very short question each? We'll put them together.
One ask a question, the other answer.
I wanted to contest the notion that speculative realism exclusively wishes to think the absolute. I think that throws us back into a nature culture economy that somehow we,
I'm not a versus for
Yeah.
speculative realism, truly.
I think it's like us to think of cultural entities and actual entities as all being actors on the single plane, like along the lines of Latour's work, your own work, and Isabelle's work, who's been a great inspiration of my work. But I was interested in particular, what the two of you had to say about risk and situated knowledge, because it seems to me that when you think about the thameness of things, that there's sort of excess to entities in the world, and that's their reality, their ability to surprise us, to stun us, and so on. So this would be the realism of the work, that we have culturalist reductionism that wants to reduce entities to language and so on. We have scientific reductivism like the other brands of speculative realism that wants to free some scientific notion of objectivity as the real. But it's this ability to surprise and taking that seriously as a placeholder in our works that is the situatedness of knowledge.
It's the whiplash.
Yes. And maybe access is not such a good word, because when we get access to house, we enter into it. And the point is not to enter into it, but rather to relate with it.
And that felt,
In an
And I recall your earlier work on hypnosis, right? That saw this as radical moment, right? Because it could surprise us, this thing.
and that felt experience of surprise, that, whoa, this is who and where we are, that astonishment, that I think is what is.
Yeah, coming back to Whitehead from the realism, I think we could make Donna let's say, an undomesticated Whiteheadian. How about that?
A wild
Yes,
idea.
a wild one.
The dingo or
I just want to comment, it's interesting, you mentioned Julie Butler was here last year. And interestingly, she chose to talk about care, this notion of care in election of ideas, and made a comment totally in the opposite direction of novelty. She didn't talk about it in the context of novelty, but meant that from a Jewish context, it might be the case that Whitehead saves too much. Saves too much. So it's rather the opposite.
Which is my problem with Whitehead's God.
Yeah.